Greeting YouTube friends. My name is David Nicholas, the founder and host of Doulos Ministries. Thank you so much for joining us as we continue to discover how to live in the Father's kingdom. Today I will be sitting down with a special guest to talk about conflict and how to deal with it. Can Christians use conflict to expand the kingdom? After the break, we will dive right in, so stay tuned. Okay, welcome back to the show. Today's guest is Dave Nicholas, and as I mentioned earlier, we will be talking about conflict. Welcome, Dave. Thank you for the invitation. I'm actually really excited to be here and to talk about this subject. Dave, we've known each other for 37 going on 38 years, and I feel like I know you pretty well. But can you give a little bit of background about yourself for the viewers at home who may not know you? Sure. So, as I look back on the journey, it's kind of muddy. And all I really mean by that is I spent most of my life not having any clear understanding of conflict. I mean, I was never taught what it actually is. There were definitely issues that involve conflict, like, getting along with people and listening and being kind and try to avoid fighting, but not actually distilling what conflict is and how to handle it, you know. But when I started to see the truth about conflict through some life experiences and also better education, my eyes really began to see the world differently. So as you put it, your eyes were opened, or at least began to become open. How long ago do you think that was? Eyes being open. Well, there were a lot of pieces that started coming together, I want to say about 2 or 3 years ago. I was involved with a small church at the time, and as a group, they pretty much handled conflict in all the wrong ways. I mean, it was a really great contrast that allowed me to see both the good and the bad sides of conflict, because all I could see was the bad. And when the church elder kind of guided me and mentored me, he really showed me the difference, and what was really going on was the bad side of conflict. So it sounds like your primary context for this journey has revolved around church. Would you describe yourself as a very religious person? Religious. Well, let's see here. I did grow up in the church. I grew up as a fourth generation Christian, so lots of good heritage there. I had really great parents with earnest hearts, very sincere for the Lord, But despite all this, I kind of grew up with a lot of fear and uncertainty in regards to, whether or not I was saved or lost. But by the grace of God, we as a family unit, I've seen this, we've grown and embraced the true gospel more and more as we've gotten older, which is amazing. Praise the Lord. And, right now I would say I'm not religious. Over the last couple of years, I've made a deliberate effort to disconnect myself from organized religion. I'm not one of those people that say I'm spiritual but not religious. I think that's kind of a cop-out. It just means you can make up whatever spirituality is good for you, and that's good for, that's not my approach. I am a Christian. I just don't identify with any particular church. I love fellowshipping with Christians in and outside of church. I just would like my primary identity to be held in heaven as opposed to here on earth with an earthly organized religion. I try to be very religious as James outlines in his book, in his letter. He outlines what pure religion is, and it's also done in Ephesians and Matthew 5 and all these really great texts that describe what the Christian life really should be like. And that is pure religion. It's not so much about the organization you're part of, but it's what's going on in your heart. So if I have this right, you were basically just going through the motions of being a Christian most of your life, And it's pretty fair to say that when you join that small church group, that really jump-started your individual walk with God. Yes, that's pretty much exactly right. The exposure to conflict really was a catalyst for my growth. All right, great. Well, let's get into the subject at hand. Now, one of your main points is that conflict can promote deep, meaningful relationships. Now, I don't know about anybody else, but to me that sounds a little backwards at first. So can you just unpack that a little bit for our viewers at home? Well, to be honest, it does seem kind of backwards. Um, because we don't really have a good definition for conflict. And so that's a really good starting place, is just to define conflict and what that is. Um, you see people who most people view fighting and butting heads as conflict, and when you are getting along, there is a lack of conflict. Well, this is fundamentally wrong. Both are closely linked to conflict, and it's our choices in the situation that create either positive or negative outcome. So here's the definition that I use. It makes the most sense to me, and for the application of this discussion, I think it is a really appropriate definition. So here it is. Conflict happens any time when there are two or more opinions or perspectives sharing the same space. And that's it. And that's what conflict is. So here's a really simple example. If I wake up and start making breakfast for my wife and myself, let's say I'm making French toast, and she comes in and tells me she would rather have pancakes. That's conflict. Dave, wait a second. Are you telling me that it's conflict just because there are two different opinions about what should be made for breakfast? That's conflict? Yes, that is basically conflict. Now, the conflict can turn negative or positive based upon the decisions made by both parties. And this brings us to our next definition, which is basically conflict resolution. Now, conflict resolution is when the differing opinions become aware of each other and make an effort to satisfy the other side, or at least to understand the other side. And the approach is always done in love and empathy to resolve the difference, or to at least understand the difference, right? And it's not coming from a place of judgment. Conflict resolution does not look like a fight. Okay, it doesn't look like, at the end, it doesn't look like one side dominated, other side is being dominated. When done correctly, there are no winners or losers. And because there are no winners or losers, really both sides wind up winning. Okay, well, I see where you're going with this, but let's look at something a little bit more complicated and heated than breakfast. What about something like a political viewpoint or something like that, a religious viewpoint? People come together and have differences of opinion on those topics. It can get really heated. You're saying that we should be able to have both sides of like a heated conversation come out as winners? Well, first off, if both parties are coming from a place of love, there really aren't going to be like heated conversations. So if it's a heated conversation, it's probably not going to be conflict in a constructive way. So let's just get that out of the way. But when both sides are genuinely interested in what the other person has to say, it isn't about convincing the other person that you're right and that they're wrong. The odds are that at the end of the conversation, both sides will probably have the same views or very similar views as at the end of the conversation as at the beginning, right? So nothing really changed except for both parties got a better understanding of each other. And this kind of interaction is only possible when both sides are honorable to the conflict and engage with love. Now so both sides winning, right? It's not winning an argument. The winning comes from that deeper connection that happens when you approach out of love, right? So this brings a deeper relationship, and ultimately it just brings about a deeper community. Like the more you expand on this, 2 people, 3, 4, 5, 6 people, if everybody can be honorable to conflict, you actually can start developing a community, which is the goal. Well, I can see where this is making sense. If everyone just treated each other with respect, then perhaps we we would be able to expand that into better communities. But is it really just that simple as just respecting each other? Well, yes, it's really basically about respect. It's really that simple. And but it's important to note that there are clear steps that bring about a deep, intimate relationship with individuals and also in communities that help build up communities. If these steps are not followed, you're basically automatically putting yourself in the mirror image of community, which is communalism. You know, without knowing the difference, it can be very frustrating and confusing. And so let's look at the steps to build a community and its counterpart, communalism. So there's basically four steps in the cycle of a community. First is the superficial, you know, what's the weather like? How are you? I'm fine. Very surface level. There's really nothing there. It's just you're not friends yet. You're trying to be friendly though, so you got to talk about something. But eventually, you're going to ask about an opinion. You're going to ask about what someone thinks about something, and eventually you'll figure out you don't think the same way, and you'll have a conflict, right? But if both sides are honorable to the conflict, exactly like what we talked about before, then you can move on to the next step, which is accountability and responsibility, right? So if we have a history of conflict, but it's done in a positive way, I start trusting you, and you start trusting me. I can come to you with more and more intimate and difficult things to talk about, and I'm holding you accountable. Your responsibility is to be honorable to the conflict, right? And you're holding me to that same accountability, right? So as we go deeper and get more and more difficult and like open ourselves up to be intimate with each other, like really sharing deep struggles and opinions, and we're honorable to the conflict, and we can be trusted to be responsible to that commitment of being honorable to the conflict, then we get this sense of community where we don't all have to be the same. We can be different, but we're accepted, we're loved, we're trying to understand each other, and there's unity in the difference, okay? And there might be a limit to that, because not everybody's going to be honorable to the conflict, so there could definitely be, the steps is basically an ideal situation, right? Okay, well, the system is basically all about free will and love, and that's God's kingdom. That's how God and His kingdom functions. He gave us free will because He loves us, and when we get to know Him, we reciprocate His love. That's how His kingdom works. So on the flip side, communalism. The communalism model is based upon force, compliance, and conformity. And there are three stages, basically. And this is where it kind of gets confusing for a lot of people because the first two stages looks really positive. The first stage generates really positive relationships. Now, if we keep the context of church, let's say you go to a church and everybody embraces you and calls you brother or sister and invites you to their house. It's all really positive, developing really positive relationships. Nothing negative. But again, this is the first step, so it's probably going to be somewhat surface level, which is to be expected because you don't know each other yet. Okay? Now, all this positive relationships kind of has an agenda. The group wants to have conformity, so through the positive interactions, they're kind of wanting you to assimilate yourself to the group so that everybody can be on the same page and agree. The next stage is social pressure, and that happens in two ways. As you agree with the group, you get included, you become part of the inner circle, and that feels really great. It's really good positive reinforcement, sort of like subconsciously, the more I agree with these guys, the better my relationships are with them. I'm included more. I have access to more fellowship. So um, it's a positive reinforcer. Now, if you tend to sort of voice your own opinions and you don't agree with the group, you could start feeling excluded because they only really want to associate with people that agree and conform. So you've got social pressure, either inclusion or exclusion. Exclusion. And the idea is you're going to exclude people just a little bit, and hopefully they get the hint they really should be agreeing, and then you're going to start including them. So the social pressure is designed for compliance and conformity. Now, if the exclusion doesn't work, there's going to you're going to be exposed to laws and rule and mandate. Basically, it's going to come down to, well, if you really want to be, let's say, baptized, you're going to have to follow all the do's and don'ts. You know, we were really friendly to you. We included you in potluck or whatever it was, hikes after church. But there's going to come a point in time where if you don't follow the rules, you're going to get kind of a lukewarm or cold shoulder. If, you know, and this basically comes down to the law of control, which is if I can't control you, I must separate myself from you. You know, in this model, love actually equals agreement. If you love us, you'll agree with us. If you're the one who's disagreeing, you're not loving enough. Okay. So that's basically it in a nutshell. Wow, that is a dramatic difference. I mean, I can see why it could get confusing. The first and second stage of communalism involves what could be perceived as a very positive experience. Most people will see positive relationships and being included as a good thing. And so how can people recognize the warning signs so that they don't get too heavily involved with communalism and see the writing on the wall, so to speak? Let me give you a couple of examples just to kind of give you some practical illustrations from my own experience. So for the side of community, the best experience I have is something that is ongoing right now. I have friends from Alaska. I spent 3 months in Alaska, and we actually relish in conflict. That sounds so backwards, I know, but we love conflict. I love hearing them talk about things that I don't agree with because I love them and they love me. And so when I talk about things that they don't agree with, they love it because we actually learn from each other. I've learned a lot from them, and I hope I've taught them something from my experiences and from my perspective. But it doesn't even matter if we've learned from each other because their perspective is valuable to me, right? Because they're my friends. They're my brothers in Christ. You know, we grew up in different Christian backgrounds for sure, way different. And even now, our belief systems are not similar in some ways. In other ways, they're right on point with each other. So we celebrate both our differences and agreements and try and learn from each other as much as we can. And if we can't learn from each other, praise God that God is, despite our differences, despite our own weaknesses, God is still hasn't given up on us, and He's still working with us, and He's working with them, right? So we can recognize that, celebrate it. You know, they've never tried convincing me of anything. I might have been guilty of that. I don't know. I really have tried not to do that. It's been something I've been guilty of in the past. But we really, as a group, try to just share, to listen, to exchange. If opinions shift, to share the shift. You know, I could go on and on. I love these guys from Alaska. And it's definitely a community of 3. But it's great. You know, I consider my time with them to be church because that's fellowship to me. Communalism. Okay. Well, I didn't spend a lot of time with this situation. I kind of opted out of it, but you could definitely see the stages of it. So there was a pastor um, who told a sermon, and his key text was, "You shall know the truth, and the truth shall set you free," which is a great text. I've actually, done lots of study and research and writing different, articles and whatever in my own journal on this text because it's powerful, and the reality of truth and the power of truth and what it does when you know truth, right? So I have no issue with him using this text, but he used it in a sermon on religious liberty. And I'm just like, the whole time I'm scratching my head. Religious liberty is definitely not a guarantee that we are promised. We're actually promised the opposite. We're promised to have religious persecution. Anyway, I don't want to get too sidetracked on that. So, a couple days after the sermon, I call him up. And I basically start out with just wanting to talk about the sermon, and he's very friendly. And then he realizes that I have an issue with the way he presented the text inside the sermon and how it was not really an honest interpretation of the text. Um, it just it didn't seem to be a good way to present religious liberty. It definitely did not seem like a good way to present the text. Anyway, so it went from friendly to kind of sidestepping and avoiding, and you could tell I was sort of being excluded. In this context, it was basically just being excluded from the conversation, right? And I could tell I was being excluded because the more I wanted to have a conversation, like, go back and forth with the Bible, go back and forth with, a dialogue. But once the pastor realized that I was not going to be in agreement with him, separation was instantaneous. The conversation was over, and we never talked about it again. And as a result, we never developed any kind of relationship that wasn't totally on the surface. How are you? Happy Sabbath. You know, very, what's the weather like? Very, very, very shallow. Okay, so those are my two examples of how they can play out in both communalism and community. And look, if you want examples, go back to the Bible. Read the Gospels. Read all four Gospels. Read how Jesus handles conflict. Read how the disciples handle conflict. Read how the Pharisees handle conflict and contrast them. I dare you to read the four Gospels and not be able to see this principle play out, on almost every single page. Now, Dave, we're just about out of time, so I just want to go over this a little bit and see if I have the concept down. If a group of people come together and practice conflict avoidance, they're never going to have any deep, meaningful conversations because they don't want to stir the pot. If conflict does come up, they will do their best to avoid it, or if push comes to shove, put distance between themselves and the other person. Have I got that about right? Yes, that is correct. The flip side will always be an effort to understand and empathize with the other side without trying to dominate the other. This will bring about a deeper relationship, even if the opinions never change. Also, it's important to really emphasize that both sides, if both sides are not being honorable to the conflict, it's really best just to disengage as soon as possible, because all you're going to get is conflict and not the good kind. Okay, well, we are out of time. Thank you so much for being here. By God's grace, this program will open up some eyes and get some good relationships being built. Well, I really appreciate being here. Thank you for having me. It's been great. Thank you very much. Join us next time on Doulos Ministries as we find out how to live in the Father's kingdom. Take care and bye for now.